Okay, so I'm Dawn Winters, director of ESL, co-teacher of this class. I'm here with Justin Mathis.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a awesome ESL teacher, co-teacher of mine for these 2 weeks, and we're going to talk today about some humanoids or shapeshifters. So these are historical creatures that are half human, half creature. The creature in the human represents that part of the human psyche that we really don't want out, do we?
Right. Yeah, it's the part that we consciously try to keep hidden, but sometimes kind of comes out whether we want it to or not.
Yeah. Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, had this idea that humans have three parts of their unconscious. There's the superego, this is what connects us to higher minded ideas and faith and religion, and then there's the ego, that's what kind of keeps things in check, and then there's the id, and that's that animal part of us, the part of us that would kill and hunt if we're hungry, that would, go after someone of the opposite sex if we really wanted them. If we didn't have this ego to keep us in check, we'd be like an animal, and that's our id. This balance, right, that it can be thrown off. And in modern day, we think of someone who just listens to their id as someone who might not be mentally stable or someone who might be murderous, but back in the day, we didn't have advanced science to explain this, right?
Yeah, and the people of the past, they tended to rely on folk studies or common knowledge or common wisdom at the time. So back before they had science to explain what was going on, they made the best guess of it that they could, but a lot of times they came up with these really fantastic, incredible stories that we kind of look at now as being impossible, but at the time were seen as very rational, logical explanations.
Right, so someone who has like a ravenous appetite and who's more violent, maybe that they would think of like they had wolf in them, or they had a part of them that was wolf-like, and that kind of born this early disease, quote unquote, of lycanthropy, being a wolf. That this, if you all of a sudden you came in my office and you started rummaging through my food and what did you have to eat, Dawn? I would think, wow, Justin's acting like a wolf. He's so hungry, but in modern day, I might have other explanations, but back then, if this was a habit or something that you were displaying, that your wife would all of a sudden say, like, Justin, there's something's come over him. He's like a wild animal. Back in the day, it would be like, well, maybe he's got this lycanthropy. Maybe he's becoming part animal.
Yeah, and they had this idea of this is actually being like a curse.
Yeah.
Right? So I know you did some research on werewolves. So
Yeah.
do you have anything you'd like to share?
So werewolves come from the Old English were meaning man, and wolf, of course, meaning the animal that's like a dog. And this, it started off way back during the days of Greek mythology, ancient Greece, when Greece kind of was the prominent society, that Lycaon, he tried to feed Zeus the flesh of a human in order to test to see if he was a god. Of course, Zeus didn't really take too well to this, right? As, in stories, Zeus does not take too well to people questioning his power.
No.
So he punished him. He turned him into a wolf as a punishment. And another part of the story, or another version of this story, Lycaon was transformed into a wolf because he murdered a child. And of course, again, this is an action that, early humans might not have been able to explain it. So clearly someone who would murder a child would have to be a wolf, or would have to be an animal to do that, to murder an innocent.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the first stories of werewolves actually come about even before the story of Lycan. You had about 500 years before that story was recorded. The Greek historian Herodotus talks about this tribe that the locals say had the ability once a year to turn into wolves and then turn back. So, Herodotus, of course, didn't believe these stories, right? He was a very educated person, but he passed them along as kind of an oddity about this group of people. And so it's interesting, even 5th century BC, we have these stories that were very current about werewolves,
and we were entertained by them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we're still entertained by them. Before entertainment, there was a time period where not everyone was educated. In fact, the mass population was not educated, and in France, they in the 16th century they held werewolf trials. So much like the witch trials, in fact, some of them kind of overlapped. You know, the werewolves were put on trial, but I mean, I've watched movies and read accounts where hangings and beheadings and trials, those were entertainment. I mean, there was no radio, there was no TV, books were expensive and rare to own, there were no libraries, so, well, what are we going to do today? We're going to go see this trial of a werewolf and maybe see him hanged or him beheaded or killed.
Yeah, it does have that kind of sport or that game aspect to it. Although recently scientists have come up with a theory for why these werewolf sightings and these werewolf trials actually happen. They think that the climate change, with the cooler temperatures and the different rainfall totals, had actually affected the wheat and the rye, which the peasant classes relied on, which caused it to grow ergot, which is a type of mold or fungus that has an hallucinogenic property, kind of like LSD.
That's crazy.
So they think that this might have been a contributing factor, but yeah, interesting.
Well, and science, and it's been retroactive science, has tried to explain not just that LSD theory, but other theories that porphyria, which is a type of disease where your body craves hemoglobin and contents of blood, and when you don't get it, your teeth turn red, you have photosensitivity, of course, photo meaning light, so you don't want to go out in the daytime, which is connected a little bit to vampires, and vampires and werewolves, some of their mythology, some of their stories overlap. Also with porphyria, you get psychosis, which of course now in 2015 we can explain psychosis, but you know, a couple hundred years ago psychosis didn't exist. Also hypertrichosis, hyper meaning a lot and trich meaning hair, is excessive hair growth, but scientists have pretty much ruled that out because that's a genetic disease, and it's not very common in Europe. So
Right.
Werewolf sightings probably weren't connected to people with hypertrichosis, but it's still a way to explain why people might have thought, hey, there are people who are in existence who are part wolf, part human. And that, I mentioned earlier the overlapping of psychosis and of the craving of blood to vampires. It's interesting, and I know you've done some research on vampires. What's really interesting about werewolves is some of those overlaps, that in Eastern Europe, and I'm going to muss this up because I don't speak this language, but werewolves were called vlodkolls, which is also the term for vampire, and they thought the way to kill a werewolf was with pure silver. So if you're going to stab the werewolf, silver, or shoot the werewolf with a silver bullet, which is a part of the vampire myth, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it is interesting how these mythical creatures tend to overlap, even though they have very different origins and very different backgrounds. This idea about werewolves, it's been around for a very long time, but it's still very popular even today. So
yes.
Why do you think that the legend of the werewolf and this interest in werewolves has endured for so long?
I think the idea that we can embrace the animal side of our, even if we think that the advancement of humans is the shedding of animal-like qualities, that we don't just get angry and kill someone, that we don't, if we're hungry, we don't just kill the next beast we see, that makes us advanced. But werewolves, it's a release, that I am going to allow my body to change with the moon cycle, and that's part of the werewolf tradition, is that when the full moon comes out, then that, if you're a werewolf, you turn into a wolf for the full moon cycle, and then when it goes back to no moon, you're back to a human. So this idea that for just a week or just those days at the full moon that we get to be an animal is fascinating, and werewolves have become more nuanced in modern day depictions, and so it becomes again a little sexier that, the werewolves that of Harry Potter and of Twilight and of Underworld, that they are more humanized and more nuanced, and that again feeds into this desire that we have of being animal-like.
Yeah, so it's kind of lost some of that negative connotation that it had in earlier periods.
Oh, sure. I mean, in Twilight, the werewolves are allies to the vampires. And so the and when the wolves become wolves, you see their eyes as being the same eyes, and their hair color turns it. So we authors today have given them the ability to have critical thinking. They've given them more human-like qualities, and where in the past a werewolf, the human version of the werewolf, would have wolf-like qualities. So if you were a werewolf, your hair might look more like, and you'd be furry, your hair would look more like fur, your eyes and your teeth would resemble more like a dog when you were a human. But we've kind of flipped the script. So our wolf qualities are more human, and our human qualities, well, if you've seen the Twilight movies, the wolves are pretty handsome. So we're not, modern day depictions, we're not looking for the ugly dog-like man over in the corner. We're looking for this really handsome, kind of bulky, kind of man's man, lumber sexual, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it totally goes against, they're the foil for the vampires. So you've researched vampires. Were vampires always as suave as, the actor who plays Robert Pattinson? Were they always that sexy?
Well, unfortunately, no. The vampire has kind of a darker history. When we think of the vampire, vampires have been common across all cultures. They're in ancient Greece. You have some suggestion in some of the biblical period, not so much the biblical literature itself, but you have vampires in Asian cultures. But when we in America think of vampires, of course, we think of vampires from Eastern Europe and from the European origins. Those Slavic countries and the dark mountains and the hills and the forests of Eastern Europe. And, with those vampires were kind of wandering spirits. They didn't really have a permanent home. And, well, when you think of the characteristics of a vampire, what do you think of?
Oh, I think of someone who's like slender, pale, is kind of a smooth talker, pretty swanky dresser. I'm thinking like the physical characteristics, and of course, the minute you see, and I'm using male pronouns because I think of a man when I think of a vampire, but when you see his teeth, he's got those large incisors, but, again, like the Brad Pitt version of a vampire, the incisors are just a little bit bigger, but, back in the older movie depictions, the incisors were incredibly long, but yeah, I think I'm a smooth kind of man about town.
Okay, so a lot of times when we're looking at the older vampires, when we have that conception of the, I don't want to say pre-modern, but the pre-20th century, or certainly pre-21st century vampire, we're really thinking of Bram Stoker's version of Dracula, which really has two inspirations. The first inspiration was Vlad Dracula, otherwise known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, who is a very real historical figure, a Romanian count, a nobleman who is well known for his cruelty, for impaling people on a pike, which is just a sharpened stick, and drives up through the body until that person dies very, very slowly.
Weren't those surrounding his castle?
He was well known for that. He used that on more than one occasion. But yeah, he would have, for lack of a better word, he would have fields of victims outside of his castle, and he used this as a way to frighten opposing armies and political enemies. And now Romanians today kind of dispute this idea of Vlad as a barbarian, and they said his brutality is overstated, but that was the legend that Stoker was familiar with, and that a lot of us are familiar with these days. And Stoker doesn't really take, when you're thinking of Stoker's Dracula, what he takes is the name of Vlad Dracula and his social standing. Mm-hmm. Because Vlad wasn't known to drink blood or anything like that, but he was a nobleman, and that, when you read Bram Stoker's Dracula, that is exactly who his count is. He is a nobleman. He is of good birth. He speaks very fluently, speaks very well. And so we have kind of two versions of the vampire. We have this one of Stoker's, and then Stoker also uses some of the Slavic myths surrounding vampires. Because the Slavic vampire folklore is actually a night wanderer. He has no real permanent home, but he comes out at night. The long teeth that you mentioned, the aversion to sunlight, the pale skin. But not all versions are the same, right? In Stoker's Dracula, you have that wonderful scene where Jonathan Harker is shaving, and the Count surprises him because in Stoker's Dracula, the Count does not have a reflection.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan accidentally cuts himself, and when the Count sees the blood, he goes into this frenzy. But some versions of the vampire story in Slavic Europe, they don't have this idea of a vampire casting no reflection. In fact, in some stories, the vampire is actually kind of in love with his own reflection.
Of course, a total narcissist, like someone who's obsessed with himself.
Yeah, and it's interesting how these stories interplay, but kind of like the werewolf, these folk stories, these folk tales of vampires were used to explain phenomenon that the local people didn't understand. So, you would have situations of drought or famine or flooding or some disease or some horrible disaster would come by, and it was always considered some malevolent or evil spirit or evil force had done this, and a lot of times the blame would fall on someone who had recently died. And so there was this idea that maybe this person was coming back from the dead and that they were causing these afflictions to happen. So they would actually go and dig up the dead bodies, and of course these people believed that the body would decay very quickly. But what actually happened is if the grave was very well sealed from water, and if it was very cold, and a lot of these areas are cold most of the year, the body would actually decay very slowly. So even weeks or sometimes months later, the body would still be very well preserved. So when they actually dug up these graves, they would find that the body looked like it had not aged at all. Like it was still alive, still wandering around. And of course when the body dies, the organs die. They liquefy, right? So they would open these bodies, they would look very full, like they were still alive. You would have blood around the mouth, around the nose, sometimes around the ears. And so local people thought these dead people were rising from their graves and feeding on the living. So this was kind of a way to, they didn't have this concept of decay or decomposition, so this was part of how they explained how these bodies looked perfectly normal.
So this is like the origin of the word the undead.
Right.
That they had died, but they had undied. Meaning to undo.
Right. This is kind of the opposite of the werewolf, where the werewolf is a living human who changes, but the vampires are also called the undead.
Yeah.
Because they died and they have now, at certain times, they are allowed to come back to the land of the living.
So, and I didn't talk about this, but in werewolves, in modern day depictions, we talked about getting turned into a werewolf as a punishment. But most of the time, the werewolves that we hear about now, they've been bitten or scratched by another werewolf. So, at what point do you know, or at what point did that vampiric bite to make another vampire? When did that come into play?
Well, I don't know the exact chronology, but I know that it was at least part of the Slavic legends over time, because that was part of what Bram Stoker incorporated into his stories from these Slavic legends. Now the idea of demons or spirits feeding on the living isn't new. This is a very old kind of story, and I know we've talked before about Lilith in the Jewish tradition. Now Lilith was a human, but at different times her story gets changed around too. Sometimes she is an evil spirit or the mother of demons or something like that, and her in the stories that see her as a demon or as a spirit woman, then she has two roles. Number one, she is a seducer of men, right? This is how she propagates the demon species, but she's also called the strangler of children. So she kills newborn infants and children. So this idea of feeding on blood, feeding on the innocent, and this is actually something you see in Stoker's Dracula, not just Dracula feeding on people, but he has three female vampires with him in this very famous scene in the book. Dracula actually feeds the women a baby that he has brought back with him. And
that infanticide, the killing of children, is, I'm sure, taboo in almost any culture that you could come across. So this horror, and I think part of the reason we are so attracted to horror is because we want to feel relief that if I have a child, I'm going to fear that child dies. But if I watch a horror story where a child is fed to three raging vampiresses, well, at least that won't happen, and this is, again, coming from a 2015, but, even when Bram Stoker was writing, the chances of an infant dying were very high, and so that was a very real fear, and maybe even the feeling that death in the form of these three women who were greedy, death as a greedy travel companion, for lack of a better term. I could see that playing into a lot of women's fears, and men's, of course, fathers' fears.
Yeah, and it's kind of a sense of, it's always horrible when these things happen, but and it was a very real fear, the sudden death of children or of infants, and this kind of gave them a way of explaining why these horrible things happen, because it's difficult for us to kind of accept that one so young could be taken. But if it is a supernatural force, if it's outside of our control, it doesn't make it right, but it gives another reason.
We always look for a reason why when something happens. And, Anne Rice, I think I could put myself out there and say she probably single-handedly brought vampires back into modern-day popularity with her Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat series. Interview with a Vampire features a little girl being transformed, and from what I know, for a vampire to transform a human into a vampire takes restraint. It's really difficult because they're craving that blood, and a vampire who bites into someone in order to transform them, they have to pull back and leave some blood there, and they have to transfer some of their blood too. So this exchange of fluids is very much a creation of family myth, and for Lestat, or I think it was Louis actually in the book, who creates a vampire out of this little girl. I mean, she is their daughter, even after 100 years. She's at that point over 100 years old, but she is frozen in time. She remains this child, and she remains the child of Louis and Lestat, which that is a strange family. That is a strange bedfellow family. Yeah. So I think, with both the werewolves and the vampires, I think the future of them I don't think they'll die. Do you?
Oh no. I think as a society we enjoy being scared too much to let these types of things go, and both the vampire and the werewolf are just such classic stories. This is something about them that has endured over time, even after the scientific revolution, and we've kind of dismissed these ideas. It's fun. Yeah.
And I think in a way they both of them are yin and yang to each other. Both of them, we can have similarities. They create families, werewolves with, attacks, and it's a little bit more violent, and vampires a little bit more suave, but it's still this biting and exchanging of almost of DNA, much like a father and mother contribute to the child. So we will always find ways to interject our desire to build families and to have that gathering and togetherness, and plus the fear of fluid exchange in general. With the 1980s came the AIDS crisis, and so people were afraid to receive transfusions, and still afraid to receive transfusions. That is connected to this idea that if I take in someone else's blood, I become them. So whether it's a vampire or a werewolf, I have a part of another human inside of me, and that is unsettling. And these stories get to the part, and I think some of the best stories get to where we are most unsettled.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, it was fun.
Yeah.
Talking to you about vampires, werewolves.
Yeah, that was excellent.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening.